Athenian democracy developed around the 5th century BC in the Greek city-state of Athens, comprising the city of Athens and the surrounding territory of Attica, and is the first known democracy in the world. Other Greek cities set up democracies, most following the Athenian model, but none are as well documented as Athens. It was a system of direct democracy, in which participating citizens voted directly on legislation and executive bills. Participation was not open to all residents. To vote, one had to be an adult male citizen who owned land and was not a slave, and the number of these varied between 30,000 and 50,000 out of a total population of around 250,000 to 300,000. The longest-lasting democratic leader was Pericles. After his death, Athenian democracy was twice briefly interrupted by oligarchic revolutions towards the end of the Peloponnesian War. It was modified somewhat after it was restored under Euclides, and the most detailed accounts of the system are of this 4th century modification, rather than the Periclean system. Democracy was suppressed by the Macedonians in 322 BC. The Athenian institutions were later revived, but how close they were to a real democracy is debatable. Solon, Cleisthenes, and Pericles contributed to the development of Athenian democracy. Etymology. The word democracy combines the elements demos and kratos. In the words monarchy and oligarchy, the second element means rule, leading, or being first. It is unlikely that the term democracy was coined by its detractors who rejected the possibility of a valid demarchy, as the word demarchy already existed and had the meaning of mayor or municipal. One could assume the new term was coined and adopted by Athenian Democrats. The word is attested in Herodotus, who wrote some of the first surviving Greek prose, but this might not have been before 440 or 430 BC. We are not certain that the word democracy was extant when systems that came to be called democratic were first instituted, but around 460 BC an individual is known with the name of Democrates, a name possibly coined as a gesture of democratic loyalty. The name can also be found in Aeolian Temnus. History. Development. Athens was not the only polis in ancient Greece that instituted a democratic regime. Aristotle cites many other cities as well, yet, it is only with reference to Athens that we can attempt to trace some of specific 6th century events that led to the institution of democracy at the end of the century. Before the first attempt at democratic government, Athens was ruled by a series of archons or chief magistrates, and the Areopagus, made up of exarchons. The members of these institutions were generally aristocrats, who ruled the polis for their own advantage. In 621 BC Draco codified a set of notoriously harsh laws that were a clear expression of the power of the aristocracy over everybody else. Quote, "This did not stop the aristocratic families feuding amongst themselves to obtain as much power as possible. Therefore, by the 6th century BC, the majority of Athenians had been enslaved to the rich, and they called upon Plato's ancestor Solon, premier archon at the time, to liberate them and halt the feuding of the aristocracy. However, the enfranchisement of the local laboring classes was succeeded by the development of chattel slavery, the enslavement of, in large part, foreigners. Solon, the mediator, reshaped the city by absorbing the traditional aristocracy in a definition of citizenship which allotted a political function to every free resident of Attica. Athenians were not slaves but citizens, with the right, at the very least, to participate in the meetings of the assembly. Quote, "Under these reforms, the position of archon was open to all with certain property qualifications, and a bull, a rival council of 400, was set up. The Areopagus, nevertheless, retained guardianship of the laws. A major contribution to democracy was Solon's setting up of an ecclesia or assembly, which was open to all male citizens. However, one must bear in mind that its agenda was apparently set entirely by the Council of 400, consisting of 100 members from each of the 4 tribes that had taken over many of the powers which the Areopagus had previously exercised. Not long afterwards, the nascent democracy was overthrown by the tyrant Pisistratus, but was reinstated after the expulsion of the son of Pisistratus in 510. This sort of aristocratic takeover was ended by the appeal by one contender, Cleisthenes, for the support of the populace. The reforms of Cleisthenes in 508 undermined the domination of the aristocratic families and connected every Athenian to the city's rule. Cleisthenes fixed the boundaries of the polis as a political rather than a geographical entity, boundaries which Solon had left permeable by formally identifying the free inhabitants of Attica at the time as Athenian citizens. Quote, he did this by making the traditional tribes politically irrelevant and instituting 10 new tribes, each made up of about 3 trities, each consisting of several demes. Every male citizen on reaching the age of 18 was now to be registered in his deme. It was this registration which confirmed his citizenship. A third set of reforms was instigated by Pericles in 462/1. While his opponents were away attempting to assist the Spartans, Pericles persuaded the assembly to reduce the powers of the Areopagus, in effect stripping it of all its controlling and supervisory powers and leaving it only as a court for cases of homicide and certain offences of sacrilege. At the same time, as soon afterwards, the membership of the Areopagus was extended to the lower level of the propertied citizenship. In the wake of Athens' disastrous defeat in the Sicilian campaign in 413 BCE, a group of citizens took steps to limit the radical democracy they thought was leading the city to ruin. Their efforts, initially conducted through constitutional channels, culminated in the establishment of an oligarchy, the Council of 400, in the Athenian coup of 411 BCE. The oligarchy endured for only 4 months before it was replaced by a more democratic government. Democratic regimes governed until Athens surrendered to Sparta in 404 BCE, when government was placed in the hands of the so-called 30 tyrants, pro-Spartan oligarchs. After a year, pro-democracy elements regained control, and democratic forms persisted until the Macedonian army of Philip II conquered Athens in 338 BC. Aftermath: Alexander the Great had led a coalition of the Greek states to war with Persia in 336 BC, but his Greek soldiers were hostages for the behavior of the states as much as allies. His relations with Athens were already strained when he returned to Babylon in 324 BC. After his death, Athens and Sparta led several Greek states to war with Macedon and lost. This led to the Hellenistic control of Athens, when the Macedonian king appointed a local agent as political governor in Athens. However, the governors, like Demetrius of Phalerum, appointed by Cassander, kept some of the traditional institutions in formal existence, although the Athenian public would consider them to be nothing more than Macedonian puppet dictators. Once Demetrius Poliorcetes ended Cassander's rule over Athens, Demetrius of Phalerum went into exile and the democracy was restored in 307 BC. However, by now Athens had become politically impotent. An example of this was that, in 307, in order to curry favor with Macedonia and Egypt, 3 new tribes were created, 2 in honor of the Macedonian king and his son, and the other in honor of the Egyptian king. However, when Rome fought Macedonia in 200, the Athenians abolished the first two new tribes and created a 12th tribe in honor of the Pergamene king. The Athenians declared for Rome, and in 146 BC, Athens became an autonomous civitas foederata. Her independence was however little more than municipal, and, though the forms of the democracy survived, Rome strengthened the aristocratic elements in the constitution. Under Roman rule, the archons ranked as the highest officials. They were elected, and even foreigners such as Domitian and Hadrian held the office as a mark of honor. 4 presided over the judicial administration. The council was appointed by lot. It was superseded in importance by the Areopagus, which, recruited from the elected archons, had an aristocratic character and was entrusted with wide powers. For the time of Hadrian, an imperial curator superintended the finances. The shadow of the old constitution lingered on an archons, and Areopagus survived the fall of the Roman Empire. In 88 BC, there was a revolution under the philosopher Athenian who, as tyrant, forced the assembly to agree to elect whomever he might ask to office. Athenian allied with Mithridates of Pontus, and went to war with Rome. He was killed during the war, and was replaced by Aristeon. The victorious Roman general Publius Cornelius Sulla left the Athenians the lives and did not sell them into slavery. He also restored the previous government in 86 BC, after Rome became an empire under Augustus. The nominal independence of Athens dissolved and its government converged to the normal type for a Roman municipality, with a senate of decurions. Participation and exclusion. Size and makeup of the Athenian population. Estimates of the population of ancient Athens vary. During the 4th century BC, there might well have been some 250,000–300,000 people in Attica. Citizen families could have amounted to 100,000 people, and out of these some 30,000 would have been the adult male citizens entitled to vote in the assembly. In the mid-5th century, the number of adult male citizens was perhaps as high as 60,000, but this number fell precipitously during the Peloponnesian War. This slump was permanent due to the introduction of a stricter definition of citizen described below. From a modern perspective, these figures may seem small, but among Greek city-states Athens was huge. Most of the thousandous Greek cities could only muster 1,000 to 1,500 adult male citizens each, and Corinth, a major power, had at most 15,000. The non-citizen component of the population was made up of resident foreigners and slaves, with the latter perhaps somewhat more numerous. Around 338 BC, the orator Hyperides claimed that there were 150,000 slaves in Attica, but this figure is probably no more than an impression. Slaves outnumbered those of citizen stock but did not swamp them. Citizenship in Athens. Only adult male Athenian citizens who had completed the military training as ephebes had the right to vote in Athens. The percentage of the population that actually participated in the government was 10 to 20% of the total number of inhabitants, but this varied from the 5th to the 4th century BC. This excluded a majority of the population: slaves, freed slaves, children, women and metics. The women had limited rights and privileges, had restricted movement in public, and were very segregated from the men. Also excluded from voting were citizens whose rights were under suspension. For some Athenians this amounted to permanent disqualification, given the exclusive and ancestral concept of citizenship held by Greek city-states. A relatively large portion of the population took part in the government of Athens and of other radical democracies like it, compared to oligarchies and aristocracies. At Athens, some citizens were far more active than others, but the vast numbers required for the system to work testify to a breadth of direct participation among those eligible that greatly surpassed any present-day democracy. Athenian citizens had to be descended from citizens. After the reforms of Pericles and Cimon in 450 BC, they would be confined to those whose parents were both Athenian. Although the legislation was not retrospective, 5 years later, when a free gift of grain had arrived from the Egyptian king, to be distributed among all citizens, many illegitimates were discovered and removed from the registers. Citizenship, commonly applied not only to the individuals themselves but to the descendants as well, could be granted by the assembly, and was sometimes given to large groups but, by the 4th century, only to individuals and by a special vote with a quorum of 6,000. This was generally done as a reward for some service to the state. In the course of a century, the number of citizenships granted was in the hundreds rather than thousands.